thank you, and thank you for all coming today, for turning out. This is a very, perhaps a little bit of an unorthodox presentation, because I hope some of you have had a chance to take a look at the ledgers, and perhaps some of you have attended some of the other ledger lectures before, but it's a rich addition to the hood, and we're very, very thrilled, both certainly at Dartmouth, but definitely in Native American Studies, to have this marvelous collection from the Mark Landsberg, marvelous collection. So I want to kind of introduce in a little bit more detailed fashion from what Kathy Hart has mentioned of how I came to this work. As she mentioned, I've been doing volunteer work for Native American prisoners and in prisons for probably about 20-some years now, off and on, not consistently. And in fact, since I've come to Dartmouth, I haven't had a chance to do it quite so much. A lot of Native prisoners end up moving very quickly through the facilities that are both in Vermont and New Hampshire, and prison. The incarceration industry really allows them to be kind of farmed out to other states like Kentucky or Tennessee, which is very difficult because then they can't see their families. So unfortunately, I haven't resurrected my volunteer project, but I hope to continue at some point to continue my work. But it has meant a great deal to me personally, but also to give a larger understanding of the history of Native education, of Native people that have still survived. And what brings me to this topic was really the unusual eliding of the concept of the prison and school, which of course is present in Captain Pratt's and eventually Colonel Pratt's image, that he wanted to have a school for the prisoners that were taken from Fort Sill. Geronimo was among them, that were arrested, and they were arrested because they were considered deviants. What they were doing was they were fighting against the encroachment of their lands, and they were fighting also against the idea of being confined to the reservation system. But they were causing all kinds of havoc for the settlers there. So what happened was Geronimo, in fact, eluded the 7th Cavalry for years and years, but finally they were rounded up and taken to Fort Marion, first to Fort Sill, but then to Fort Marion, which is St. Augustine in Florida. And the epithet of the day was the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And Colonel Pratt was a different kind of military man. He, rather than the idea of extinguishment or genocide, he said what we need to do is to kill the Indian and save the man. He had the notion that you could kind of expunge the Indianness from Native people and then hasten the assimilation process. Now, certainly in his day, he was very much a radical, because that was not a popular opinion. The idea was, get Indians out of the way, we're moving west, we're taking the land. But he said he wanted to do otherwise. So his kind of a social experiment, I think you would call it, at Fort Marion, was to take these 72 prisoners, adult prisoners at that time, and he took their shackles off, and they were in, and if anyone's been to St. Augustine, you know the structure. It's very much of a medieval kind of structure, and they were housed there. And he brought in materials to give them, crayons, pencils, colored pencils, and ledger books. And the idea that kind of drives my interest and my theme throughout of all of this presentation, but all of my work, has been the idea of the ledger. The ledger really is something about marketing, commodities, inventories, and it's a very useful tool. I have one here, with the modern ledger. Still very much, looks much the same as it did in the 19th century, right? And but the idea of the ledger is to itemize commodities, itemize things, profit and loss kind of assessments. Excuse me. And when it turns to be an odious item is when you're listing human beings. And we can think of that in terms of the Dawes Allotment Act that listed Native people according to their blood quantum, their gender, their name, and then we're given a number. You can think of it in terms of the slave ship accounting. You can think of it in terms of plantation accounting. So the ledger is an innocent enough item, but when it's turned into something that itemizes human beings according to certain features and characteristics that is supposed to organize them according to something else, they become objects. The humanity gets drained out of it, and certainly this is true in the prison as well. So So Pratt's project got to be something that I don't think he expected, but it wasn't encouraged for them to draw, but they did, and they drew images of their memories. They drew images of what was happening to them within Fort Marion, the kinds of teaching, because he had missionary people come in and preach. They needed to be Christianized, of course. So, so this was his kind of his social experiment. And so the idea became connected of creating a prison in a school, and that's kind of the focus of my examination of the ledger, and the ledger is kind of the symbol of that. So with this idea, when I was in Ithaca and still at Cornell, the idea came to me to add to my volunteer work this notion of the ledger. Now, the men in both of the institutions in New York State was Auburn Institution and Cayuga. They're both Auburn is Supermax, and Cayuga is maximum security. Excuse me. The native men there had no idea what ledgers were. They didn't come up into an understanding, even though they were native, some of them from reservations. They just didn't have a background of what the ledger was. So part of the volunteer work that myself and my colleague did was to take in books, films, documentaries. We would just discuss. We would have a talking circle. It was always opened up with a drum. The drum was very important to them, to keep them together as a unit within the prison. They sang their songs, and then we shared. And so we shared the information about the ledger, and they just took off with it. This was very, very poignant for them, this idea of creativity within captivity. And they wanted to do something themselves. In fact, the interesting palimpsest of Auburn Prison, I just want to add a footnote, is that it actually is, it's the oldest maximum security prison in the United States, and it looks like one of those medieval constructions, very much like the Shawshank Redemption, actually. And it's built on a massacred Cayuga tribe settlement. So the palimpsest of all of this is very, very interesting in itself, just in the physical geography of the place. But the men became very, very enthused about this. And so I got the grant and got materials into the prison, which is a very long process because it's very difficult to take things. Everything's considered contraband, you know, and I, you know, it was hard enough to get to be a volunteer in a supermax prison, but eventually we got materials in, and they started producing these amazing pieces of poetry, artwork. So they made some things with whatever they had, popsicle sticks, items that they found in the prison yard, like feathers that had fallen from crows flying over. And these things, they assembled together, and it was their statement of their humanity to the outside. And I said, this can't go to waste. So I started the idea of having an exhibit of their work on the outside. And I called it Art Across Walls. So they were especially excited when they realized that they were not just creating this voice, but that it was going to be heard and seen and experienced by people on the outside. They were very eager to have this done. So part of what I did was I extended the idea of this ledger and took ledgers inside as well as materials. And they produced amazing pieces. And I've brought reproductions of a number of them to share with you today. And the reason what I'm going to do is pair up a number of pieces that they did with some of the ledger pieces here, because it's astounding, some of the resonances that you will see. I have an example here from, we didn't buy them these ledgers, because these kind of ledger books have come to be very expensive. But at the end of the art show, what I had the people that attended the gallery, and it was open for about 2 weeks, that they wrote their messages back to the men inside. So there was this sense of communication across the walls. It was art across walls meant that there was a reciprocity about the project. So this was one example of a Tuscarora, thoughts from a down Tuscarora. And he did mostly writing. He did some art projects as well, but beautiful lettering. And then he tells about his life. He talks about what his childhood was like. And at the very last page, he says, Yahweh, which is the Tuscarora word for thank you. I am glad you took the time to read through my thoughts and feelings. I look forward to hear some feedback. Take care. So there's this yearning for a sense of humanity. Now, I had no illusions, and in all of the years that I've been doing the volunteer work, I've had no illusions about what these men have done. Some of it is pretty heinous. And I never asked them what their crimes were. I felt that was not the reason I was there. Sometimes those stories would come out. I visited them every week for about 3 or 4 hours for several years. So eventually some of the stories came out, and it was not pleasant. So I think it's important that not to romanticize any of this, but to never forget the humanity that is involved. And we're all too eager, I think, to have our criminal population out of sight and out of mind. You know, lock them up, throw away the key. We don't want to see that in our society. And that says much more about us in many senses than it does about the people that are behind bars. So I just wanted to add that, because there is some kind of literature, prison literature out there that is very kind of tries to romanticize prison life. There's nothing romantic about what happens there, and there's nothing romantic about feeling nostalgic or having some sense of an illusion about the crimes. The crimes are there, the men are doing the time, and they admit it. So, not in all cases, you know, there are always ones that say they never did it. But at any rate, so I took ledgers in, and what they produced was pretty amazing. So, as I said, this is going to be a little bit of an unorthodox kind of presentation, because perhaps more than specific discussion about the pieces that you see, you thought there was enough ledgers in the room, didn't you? Well, I brought more. I'm bringing some that actually echo amazingly, and they never saw any real ledgers. I took in a few examples, but it's hard to get too much in behind the bars. Now, here is one example. For example, here we have the Battle of Greasy Grass, and we have a White Swan, who was a scout for, excuse me, I'm sorry, I was probably standing right in the way here, was a scout for Custer. And here we have a cavalry bugler, and two from the cavalry here. And this is a Lakota prisoner. His name was Cloud. I'll just use first names. And this was done on regular ledger paper. I just blew it up for got my, I hope that doesn't mean I'm I don't know, hooked up.
You've been doing fine without it.
But this is a bloody day. I'll just keep talking. And he has this drawing of his understanding of greasy grass. And he has the cavalry, and he has his Lakota, his imagery of his Lakota ancestors. And here's another one that he did, and he called it Love White Cloud. He just called it Love White Cloud, Running Deer, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse. And it's set in a contemporary setting. This is very interesting. Now, let's see, I want to make sure. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't know I knocked that off. I apologize.
That's no problem.
Sometimes I gesticulate a little too energetically.
There you
Okay, thank you. Okay, so another piece that I think is really interesting, and this will be a little harder to see, but it's around the back here. There is, let's see. Yeah, I want to get back here. Yeah, just hold that for a minute. I matched this up a little bit with this piece over here of Frank Henderson, and it's this is a formation of infantry soldiers firing at an Arapaho warrior, and I paired this up with this again is Cloud. For The Only Good Indian is a Dead Indian. I don't mind handing this around because they're reproductions if you'd like to see them. Now here's another piece that is done by a Cheyenne artist, unknown artist, and this is a portrait of George Bent on a turkey hunt. And this particular piece, and I don't mind, I can take this off. It's done on a piece of manila folder. I mean, the men use what they have, right? And it's his drawing of a turkey hunt. So interesting. And I mean, I gave them no subjects to work on. This was their spontaneous work. So I was amazed when I saw these pieces, and they were so resonant with what the prisoners had done. Okay, on this side, which hopefully you'll all be able to see a bit, on this side is really quite an interesting piece because it's a picture of water, and water being a real sometimes rare item on the plains. It's marked with flags and prayer flags and so on, and Isaiah is the artist that did these. He's the same one that did the turkey pieces, but he did 4 renditions of waterfalls, which I thought was interesting. And they're done in envelopes that he procured. And I thought if you'll take a notice of the way they're done, he didn't take the whole face of the envelope to draw them. They're done just on a tiny corner. There's this sense of enclosure and small space, that there's not enough space to even fill the envelope, right? This piece I added because it was so interesting. While I was volunteering, my mother had passed away, and I went on Friday to the prison anyway, and I was leaving the next day for the funeral. And the men had heard about it, and because I had told them, and they made this beautiful condolence card for me, and they all signed it. And the Chino, who is a Navajo, and I'll pass this around if you will, who drew it, also made a remarkable cross out of deer horn that his family had sent him. He made a cross and he hung it on a buckskin strap, and he gave it to me, and I went to the funeral, and he said, "This is for your mom." So I buried it with my mom. So all of these experiences are tremendously personal for me, and there was this sense of sharing on a level of family, and part of my motivation that kept me going through some pretty grim times with this work, because it's not happy work always, is the idea of extending community across walls and reminding that there yet, but for a flip of fate, myself or any one of us could find ourselves in a situation. We don't like to think of that, but in some cases it's amazing, a flip of fate. So it's a humbling experience, as well as educational. I want to just quickly, while we're in this room, the men, as I mentioned, it was very important for them to start their communal event, which was every Friday. We went there, but to start it with the drum and the song. And this piece here, which is Robert Ridge Walker, is a Cheyenne It depicts the social dancers and drummers here. And this was a shield that they drew. And again, these are just, some of it has come apart over time because they weren't well attached. But just with the material, it's done on masonite that they got from their from the shop. And they made this depiction of how important the drum is for them inside the prison. And their vision is from on top of the drum, and you see the drummers around it in this heart. So I'll let that come around if you're interested in seeing it. So you can start to see when I started leafing through this amazing collection and the variety and the humanity reflected across the years, I couldn't help but make these connections with my brothers incarcerated and their expressions of life that turned out not at all the way they had planned, but there they are. And that this idea of communication, this idea of community, this idea of having someone from the outside come in and affirm their humanity is tremendously important. The things, I mean, we know from the news and some, if you read about these matters, what happens in prison, but just the odd daily things. They say that, what is horrible is the loss of privacy, that nothing about you is ever private again. And I don't think we can imagine what that is. But that's one of the most abusing things that they feel. But things like when they're transferred, one particular Buck, his name was, he was transferred. They said he was going to be transferred. The COs said he was going to be transferred to another prison, and he was a bit of a troublemaker. He was always he wasn't a fighter, but he would resist being pushed around by the correctional officers, and they didn't like him. They put him on a bus, and he was on the bus, literally that bus, he was on a bus for a month and a half, moving from place to place. They would stop when he had to go to the bathroom. It was a prison bus, it was all grilled, and that's where he was. And then they finally brought him to where he was supposed to go. And the record of that is lost within the interstices of prison bureaucracy. But it just gives you just a little tiny snippet of the kinds of indignities and the loss of humanity that this situation achieves. And it's a good wake-up call for us to know these things. It's not comfortable knowledge, but I think we as responsible citizens need to know what's happening. Because definitely we need a correctional system, but it has to reflect our humanity. Otherwise, there's something amiss. So I have a few other things that I want to share in the next room. And if you wouldn't mind, just leave it. You can, when you're done, if you could just leave it up on your chair, that will be fine. This will be very brief, so if you want to just stand for a moment, because we'll be going into the next room, that's where we'll spend the most time. I just wanted to point out here, this is this is part of the Vincent Price collection, and in many of these pieces you'll see such beautiful shield work. And I wanted to point that out, this beautiful shield work here, like the shield that you saw. They always did shields. They did beautiful shields. Sometimes it would have a handprint, or sometimes it would be a depiction of the ghost dance. And some of them were really, really fine artists, but the shield, again, is the symbol of protection, right? Protection even within this situation of they find themselves. I kind of paired this up, which is Frank Henderson piece, and what's notable about Frank Henderson is in a couple of his ledgers, there's this frontal facial facing the viewer, which is rather unusual. And so I brought, again, this is one of Cloud's work. He's Lakota. He's a little bit cranky on this one. And he's written words in Lakota around it. And I thought that was unusual because you don't see that frontal address so often in the ledgers, and Frank Henderson does that. And let's see. This piece is interesting. This is a piece of showing a warrior who has been hunting an enemy. And more than the subject, I thought the configuration really matched with this piece well. And I don't have a blow-up of this one, but I will pass it around. Again, Cloud, he was pretty prolific. But he does a drawing here of himself. And this is a fellow native person bringing him the chanupa, the sacred pipe. So while in this piece it's an enemy seeking out an enemy in a hidden place, this example shows native men serving each other's spiritual needs while they're inside. And of course he draws kind of a bird's eye view of the cell. You have the loo and the bed and very, very small area. So I can pass that around too. And that was reminiscent of that. And I thought of it because they all talk about that their greatest enemy is themselves. They've often said that if you'll go in the prison and the penitentiary and you either turn into an animal or you turn into someone that cares about spiritual matters. It's such a sharp choice there. And a lot of the men work very hard. And they really feel that a lot of what took them there, this is one of his messages. This is what kills us. AIDS, guns, money, drugs, church. How about that? You know, and I'll tell you a little bit of background with that. It's very interesting, at least in Auburn, and I know it does happen in different prisons, that native prisoners are not always allowed their space or their objects that are necessary for their spiritual sustenance, right? Which could be the sweat lodge, it could be eagle feathers, the pipe, sage, tobacco, things. So, many prisons they use these things as ways to control. And even though organized religions, whether it be Christianity or whatever, Jewish rabbis come in, and of course Islam. They have a carved out place that is structured and organized, but it's difficult for the native men to find that. So, at least in Auburn and other prisons that I've heard of, they often relegate and assign the Christian cleric, whoever it might be a priest who's assigned from the state, assigned to the prison, and he's in charge of all of the native items, and he'll often make them sit through a mass in order for them to be able to have their pipe or their drum or their eagle feathers. So they see very much they call him Black Robe. So so we can move into the next area. Thank you. This here. Oh, yes, thank you. If you could just read, you might just hold taking that, this. Thank you. Good. That's good. If you could just take that, this, that's great. Thank you. All right. When I saw these pieces here, I just love these. The cording, this whole section is just lovely, this cording section. And so I wondered what to connect with this. And Ken, who is an Apache prisoner at Cayuga prison, did this drawing of Diana, a painting of Diana. Pretty amazing. And I think this was more of a memory of a girlfriend on this side. But it's, of course, another difficult thing to be away from their loved ones, and so I paired that up. And also this piece here, which shows this is, let's see, yeah, this is an unknown, a Cheyenne artist, that's right. But it's a self-portrait of Arrow, and a young woman who is thought to be getting counsel from Glad Road, who is a famous medicine person, who is actually a Berdache man-woman, right? But, so I paired that with Medicine Woman from Cloud again. I want to see that. So he didn't tell me if that was a girlfriend. I have a feeling it was. Yes. And then, excuse me. Over here. This section, they traveled far away and returned changed. Again, here is another example of was done by Chino, who was Diné, or Navajo. And it was his symbolic sense of his home. And he kept this in his cell and offered it to me before I left, and wasn't able to visit anymore. And he's the same one that made the condolence card. So this sense of recapturing a sense of home is tremendously important and becomes a recurring theme in different ways. You saw it with Isaiah and his paintings of, he was from Georgia, and his memories of hunting there, and that pheasant, or the turkey, the wild turkey, and also the beautiful waterfalls. So this sense of traveling far is really significant. I can pass that around as well. And they really said that they really got tremendous nourishment from these recollections of home. And of course, this kind of relates again to the notion that the prisoners that I worked with have of the black robe, right? Of being lined up and having to sit through a mass or a Christian service before they're allowed to have their own ceremonies. But of course, this talks about the education within the prison/school, right? The combination, the intersection of those two. And I think if you look closely at this one, you can almost see this particular instructor on the little thing that might be a blackboard. It looks like it says G-O-D, I'm not sure, and then it looks like another language next to it. So perhaps a kind of an attempt to translate this sense of God and the sense of sin, which is really interesting, especially back in the 19th century, because many native languages, for example, the idea of sin was difficult to convey, especially original sin, because I know in my own language, Tuscarora language, there is no word for that. The closest you could come is mistaking one thing for another. So the idea of eternal damnation for sin was a very difficult concept to convey and to inculcate, right? So let's see, I have a couple of others, and they are actually under here. I'm sorry. I told you this was going to be unorthodox. You have to be hopping all over the place. And this kind of relates to this whole section of the beauty of the horse. And again, we have our very talented Cloud, who created this, again out of the shop. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? And you'll see that the ears have fallen off and their hoof has fallen off, and that's not my fault. There is a note that a fellow prisoner wrote to him and apologized because he had it in his cell looking at it. Cloud had loaned it to him before he gave it up for the exhibit, and he said the officers had just come down and shaken down his cell. So they just came and threw everything around. So that's how that got injured, but it's survived pretty much. And that very much the beauty of the horse, and of course Cloud is from South Dakota. And then the final piece I have here, let's see.
Is Alex still in prison?
Yes, most of the men are, their crimes are serious enough. They're in at least 25 to life. And when I mention about, the edgy chance of these things happening, I'll tell you one story of a young man who was 23 at the time, young Seneca man, Andy, and he had a football scholarship to a school somewhere in Ohio. Lovely young man. He's about 6'5", and he had been out off the reservation, and he had been speeding, and he had been drinking, and the troopers, the New York State troopers, chased him onto the reservation, and by rights, their rights stopped there, but they continued to chase him, and they stopped him, and they pulled him out of the car, and he and his friend were there, and his friend had another key, and while they were checking, he said they shouldn't have been on my reservation, so he put the key in, jumped into the car, they resumed the chase, and he got onto an exit of the New York State Thruway and right into a family of 4. And that was it. And so he's in for homicide, vehicular homicide. And I don't know what his sentence is, but it certainly is a long one. But there's a young life. And when I say but for a moment, it's not all so, but many had terrible lifetimes. The young man that created, Roger, that created the piece that I'm going to show you next, was on his own from age 7, picking out of garbage cans to find food. And he was probably one of the most thoroughly angry human beings I've ever met. And his father had abandoned him, had apparently gone to Alaska from the Southwest, and he left home at 9 to try to find his father. And his father, he found him. He had a few, I don't know how he did it at 9 years old. He was pretty street savvy. But he found him, and when he got to be 15, I guess he got a little mouthy, his father threw him out. And he's been, since 15, he's been in the system. And he will probably always be in the system. But he drew this on his bed sheet from the cell. And I actually had to be a little bit criminal myself to get it out. I wasn't supposed to get it out, but it was winter time, and I stuffed it under my coat. But it's an amazing piece, and it's, if you can get close enough to it to see what he's done, is he's recreated the wall. And it's interesting to think of recreating a wall, but on something so flimsy, it's really interesting, but it's lying, just tell me the truth, trust, maybe in time, broken and left here to die. Paying with years of my life, youth has been taken away. Fighting always with myself. Lost, will I ever be found? Looking and yet still not seeing. Worthless every time I try. Hunger for peace I can never find. Pain too deep to repeat. Let's see, there's other pieces. Let's see. Finding the one who knows how to guide me. Love that I can never find. Hate, I guess it's my fate. Death, when will my life end? And then over here, alone, where no one can find me. And then there are these images that he's just clipped out of magazines, right? And some are images of the outdoors, of a life that's of freedom that's no longer his. And again, I don't think I have to apologize for the state of it, because it's made under very crude circumstances, but it gives you this reflection of his internal life. And I kind of paired it up again with this Muslim, because it's a kind of a used of the same material, but in his case, there's an accounting of his battles, right? This is a teepee liner. This is a cell liner. Right?
Does he know that you have this?
Yes, oh, he gave it to me. He said, show it to everybody you can.
Oh.
So that's what I'm doing. Excuse me, I don't want to stay in your mind, but it's a powerful piece. It's a very powerful piece. It was worth a little transgression on my part, I think.
Communicate with any of these people today?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, because when you get into work like this, I don't want to, again, either romanticize or to objectify or make my project for my embellishment. I want to remain in a place that continues to let me see these people as human beings, because they are my brothers. They called me sister all the time. And every time I went out of the prison, it would be 10 or 10:30 at night, and it was the last time that all the prisoners would come into the yard. And it was a little bit of a scary time, because, the lights would be on. It literally looked like the Shawshank Redemption yard. Someone told me that they did part of the shooting there. So you see these kind of rows of human beings stacked up, on 4 floors. But when I went out, they surrounded me. They surrounded me. I never felt afraid, but the yard was full at that time. But I'm sorry, I digressed from your question. You said,
Interesting.
No. You asked me.
I asked you if you still communicate
Yes,
with anyone.
I do. Through Cornell, they still send it to Cornell. They didn't know that I had moved, but you have to ask yourself, what would happen if one got out and knocked on your door? That's the reality of it. Most of them were in for very, very long times or for life. But, I had to temper my imagination about what I was doing there with this reality of, they could come to my door and say, sis, can you help me out? You said you're my sister. What do I do? So, it's very reality-based, and I'm not sure I have answers to all those things. But, I don't think that they would put me in that position, but they might, in a situation. So these are kind of the pairings that helped me kind of expand my understanding of the power of the ledger. Because the ledger really is a way to kind of continue a sense of humanity, continue a sense of memory, of recording one's life, one's experience under these terrifically difficult circumstances, creativity in captivity. And I couldn't help but align my experiences and what the men shared with me with many of the contexts that we see of the art here.
When did the ledger painting start? Was that
That's very difficult to say, because the ledger itself, the idea of drawing is just an extension of drawing on hides that was always done on muslin, then on muslin, and later ledger books got to be part of what was accessible material. So it wasn't just in the prison or in the school that it happened. And I would say in the early 1800s. Right, but the area that I'm focusing on, at least conceptually, for this comparison that I've been making, it's really around the Fort Marion experience of the prisoners, and then the Carlisle Indian School, of course, that came after that, which was the idea to take children instead of adults and have them assimilate, force them to assimilate, which is a very painful experience as well. But Colonel Pratt, he was doing the best he could. He was a real reformer of his day, and nobody agreed with him, but he fought on. So we have to take these things in the context, the historical moment that they occur. Yes.
When Pratt was doing his thing down in St. Augustine, Fort Marion, were any of the people you worked with aware of any of that history? I know you said the ledger they weren't aware of, but what about what happened at Fort Marion and the background of the Indians? Were they aware of that?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question. Are you asking?
Were the people you worked with in prison aware of Fort Marion and what they went through?
Yes, yes, but they weren't before we went in. That was part of the outreach, was kind of informing them of what this ledger meant to them. And of course, inside the prison, they know what ledgers mean too. You know, they've each got their number tattooed on their arm for life. And that's their identity, and it's that reduction. They got it right away, and they felt this affinity with the whole process. But they hadn't heard about it before. And it became a figure for them that was a very powerful way to find a voice that in this case is stretching far beyond those walls. And I'm glad to be, you know, kind of the mediator for that.
I didn't hear your introduction, so I may be asking
No, that's
something
okay.
you've already answered. I don't know if you have Native roots, but what do Native Americans, because most of us are Native Americans, what do they call themselves? Do they call themselves
Well,
First People, or?
That's one term, especially in Canada. You'll hear that term a lot. In my way of thinking, anyone that's born here is Native American.
Yes.
I really believe that. But tribal people prefer to be called by their own tribal name. I'm Tuscarora. You know, the kind of the PC term is Native American. It used to be American Indian. I prefer, actually, if I'm thinking of the global term, I prefer American Indian, because that's the term that's used in the treaties. And those treaties are an important tool for us to assert our sovereignty and our sense of this connection with a specific history that is not immigrant history. It's indigenous history. It's autochthonous to this land. Yes, so everyone pretty much wants to be called by their tribal name. We're in the Anishinaabe, which would be Chippewa, or Diné, Navajo, because you belong to that place and that people. Sure.
Did you work with any women?
Pardon me?
Did you only work with men?
I only did, and that's a missing piece for me. I would really, really like to, and someone very recently has called me, and I might be able to work with some women. I would love to. Because that's unfortunately in the contemporary scene, the incarcerated women all across the board, not just natives, those numbers are growing in alarming rates. But certainly among native population, but apparently across all populations, the number of women that are being incarcerated within the last 5 years has tripled. And you know, I don't pretend to understand the social, all of the social forces. I can imagine some, but I think that's very significant. But certainly that's impacted Native women very, very strongly. But so I would like to do that.
There are men very interested.
Yes. So if I don't know if any of you can join me, but I'd like to kind of make a little connection with all of these to some of the contemporary Native pieces, and I know some of you might need to be on your way, but if you can join me on the floor downstairs, on the first floor, there are just a few pieces I'd like to share that if you have a moment. There's a lot of walking. He's taken as a canvas a sheet from the Dawes Allotment Act, which was from the Dawes Allotment Act was an attempt to get land away from Native people, but to also forcibly assimilate them into agrarian lives, from the plains especially. And he has this sheet that lists, as I mentioned, you know, what his ledgers do. Full, you'll see half, quarter, this is blood quantum, right? And then there's a number for them, then a name, then their age, and male or female. And he actually, his grandmother, Mabel Carr, is listed. She's age 4 at this point in time. So what he's done is taken the ledger. What a lot of contemporary Native artists have done is taken this concept of the ledger as this itemizer and commodifier of humanity and flipped it on its head, which is a very subversive and richly satirical, wonderful thing to do. And it's taking your power back. It's exerting your agency. And so he has done it in that way. You'll see here a picture of children from the Carlisle Indian School, some of them taken as young as 3. And Steve Deo, who's Creek and Yuchi, takes this picture and he names this "When We Become Our Role Models." And I don't know if any of you remember the Dick and Jane books, but I grew up on Dick and see Dick run, see Jane, see Spot run.
Yes.
Spotted Sally. Oh, I forgot about Sally. Yes, but so this idea of that those were supposed to be the ideal children, right, and the ideal education. So he's making this contrast between what was happening to Native children here and this Dick and Jane imagery, and then he has these kind of spectral presence of keys. And one could look at that in so many ways. It could be that this was supposed to be the key to their future, a key to the past. You could see it as an imprisonment of sorts. There are many ways to interpret that. He's left that open. But then you see in the corner here these two Native children, just being themselves, right? So there's a lot going on here. And Linda Haukas, there's another piece here. Again, using the concept of the ledger itself as a canvas. Right? And in this case, she just probably found this at, like you would find it at a flea market or something, because it's, let's see, this is balances. It has nothing to do with Native people at all. It's just balances maybe from a bank or something. But she turns this, because it's about the concept of the ledger. And this one is called Return from War Dance. And you see, these are women, they have the war staves with them, and they're facing this history of the ledger. And they actually pull us into facing it as well, you see. So the ledger becomes, again, a figure of this past, this very abusive past, but contemporary Native artists are turning that around. Now, this doesn't say anything much about ledger specifically. It's the most amazing piece. You could, excuse me, Brad Kellhammer is a marvelous contemporary artist, and he was adopted out when he was, I think, 6 months old. He doesn't know his family, but he was adopted out and grew up in Wisconsin, where there really weren't very many Native people around, and he was very aware growing up that he looked very different and he came from elsewhere. And so a lot of his artwork is a lot of this quest for where he comes from. He knows it's the Southwest, but even though this does not bespeak specifically ledger, what it does hark back to with his background is that there was a time when Indian children were just willy-nilly taken away from their families and adopted out with the goodwill, they're going to have a better life. But then they lost their connection with their people, with who they really were, and his entire the entire impulse here is very interesting. You see, he calls this an autobiographical quadrant here, and you see him here, but he represents himself as not fully is in skeletal form. And this is kind of, you might consider it a narrative connecting all of these things, right, and coming back to his mind. And this is just rich. One could talk for hours about this piece, but even though it's not ledger per se, you see it speaks still to this colonial imposition of thinking that there was a better way than who natives were. I'll turn quickly to I'll turn to this piece, which is in the here, and this is specifically prison related, and Dwayne Wilcox, who is Lakota, very, very humorous. I really enjoy his art, but he is depicting here the title "Luke Failed to Communicate." He came to this subject because I guess his son was in and out of, for petty crimes, in and out of jail, and he said he noticed one day that all of the other people lined up in the prison were also Native American and Native in some way. So there is this eliding, even before Fort Marion, there was a notion that natives were deviant. They were deviant because they weren't Christian. They were deviant because they didn't hold private property in a certain way. There were all of these assignments of deviancy and criminality that had nothing to do with anything except being Indian. Sherman Alexie, who's a very, very well-known Native writer and author and poet, has said, you know, it's subversive just to be Indian, because our story and our narrative runs counter to the triumphal story that most of us are told in school. And when Native children don't hear, then see themselves represented in the American history, that's very problematic. It's where am I in all of this? So, you know, thank goodness we have Dartmouth here and Native Studies, but it should be happening much earlier. I'm always surprised at how little these bright, wonderful students that come here, how little they know even about the Native people and the tribes that are in their own backyards, you know. So, and these are the first people, you know, and there's just a rich exchange to be had. It's not who's right or wrong, it's just this marvelous exchange that's been missed, you know, and hopefully these are ways to recuperate it in some way. Thank you. Thank you.